Hello, Algebra 2. Today's topic is day 5, and we're going to be solving quadratic equations algebraically. There are 2 learning targets today. One of them is I can calculate the discriminant of a quadratic equation and determine the number of solutions. The second one is I can solve a quadratic equation over the set of complex numbers using an appropriate strategy, including factoring and quadratic formula. Before we start into the new material, I want you to review these 2 items. So go ahead and pause the video and write in the 4 ways to express a solution to a quadratic equation, the 4 words from the last notes in class, and the 3 ways a solution to the quadratic equation might look. The 4 ways to express a solution to a quadratic equation are zeros, roots, solutions, and x-intercepts. And your 3 ways a solution to a quadratic equation might look: having 2 real solutions, 1 real solution where the vertex is right on the x-axis, or no real solution. And we're going to be talking today about what that means. What kind of solutions would they be if they're not real? But first, I want you to go ahead and realize there's always 4 ways to solve any quadratic equation. The first step is always to set the equation equal to 0, and then the 4 ways are graphing by hand, using the calculator to calculate the zeros. The third step is factoring and the quadratic formula. So first, let's just review the graphing. Go ahead and practice the graphing, graph this equation, and plot it on our coordinate plane. So go ahead and pause the video and try that. When you graphed this equation by hand, you found that your vertex was -2, -1. Your y-intercept is 3, and then you can reflect that point over. And then when you graph it, you see that your x-intercepts are where it solves. That's where the zeros are. And there's 2 real solutions for this graph, and that would be at -1 and -3. A second way to solve this equation is using the calculator. And when you put the equation into the calculator, remember, you put in y equals and you type your equation in, then you hit graph. There's a couple different ways you can solve by graphing. The first one is you can look at the table and see where the zeros are, where the y is equal to 0. So here if it is exactly at -3, 0 and -1, 0. So it shows up in the table. Now, if it didn't show up in the table, we could also calculate it. If it wasn't an integer, it won't show up in the table exactly. So we can also calculate it with the graphing calculator. The steps to do that are to hit our second and our trace button for second calculate, and then we hit the 0 button, number 2. And hit enter. Then it's going to ask us left bound, and we want to move the cursor to the left of the 0. So always from left to right our graph. So if I'm calculating this 0, we're going to move it to the left of it below here and hit enter. And then it says, can you move it to the right bound? So you're going to go past it and move it to the right of the 0. And then hit enter. Then it wants you to move it close to it. It says guess. So then you move it onto the spot and hit enter. And it'll calculate for you. So there it calculated -1, 0. Let's write down those steps in our notes now. And remember, there are 2 ways with the calculator. One is looking in the table. So here I wrote that one down. The second one is for when it doesn't show up in the table and you have to calculate them. So here are the 5 steps that I talked through in the video. Please pause the video and write those steps down. It comes in handy to confirm your quadratic formula equation or another method that you might use. Okay, our last 2 methods for calculating that we'll be learning tonight are the factoring and the quadratic formula. So factoring is probably our fastest way to solve a quadratic equation. When you have this equation, we can factor and then set them equal to 0 to find our zeros as well. So let's do the same equation. We already know the answers, but let's go ahead and factor. So we have x squared plus 4x plus 3 equals 0. And pause the video and go ahead and factor this. Okay, you should have got x plus 3 times x plus 1. When you factored x squared plus 4x plus 3, now you want to use the zero product property and set each factor equal to 0. Because if this factor is 0, the whole thing is 0. If this is set equal to 0, then the whole equation here is 0. So that's why there's 2 to set equal to 0. And then you solve for x. So if I solve for x on this side, we'd have x equals -3. And then on this side, our x equals -1. So you can see already that there are 3 methods that find the same answer to that same equation. So when you have a choice, you get to pick your favorite method. Our last method, the quadratic formula, is sometimes the only way you can solve it. So that's going to be an important method for us to find. We'll be talking about that shortly in the next couple problems. First, let's reinforce some more factoring ways. Let's look at the next page and or the bottom of the page first. And just reminders, regardless of which method you use, you always need to set your function equal to 0. So always set your equation equal to 0 before you try any of the methods. And then you can check your answers. When they're real answers, you can check them by substituting them into the equation. You substitute the x value into the equation and you should get y equals 0. That's how you always check. Okay, I want you to go ahead and we're going to try solving by factoring. So think back to last unit and I want you to try to factor number 1 and then try to solve if you can. So when you factored x squared minus 2x minus 8 equals 0, you should get x minus 4 times x plus 2 equals 0. Now you want to use the zero product property and set both factors equal to 0. So x minus 4 equal to 0 and x plus 2 equals 0. Now you solve for x. So I'm going to add 4 to both sides here. And x is 4. And I'm going to subtract 2 from both sides and get x equals -2. So our equation here, it has 2 zeros, and or we could call them x-intercepts since they're real, and the solutions as well is another word you can use, and it would be at -2 and at 4 would be our solutions. Now I want you to go ahead and try number 2. Try to factor number 2 and try to then solve. Okay, so you should have factored out your greatest common factor of 4 first. Then notice this was a difference of squares and factored that. Then you set each factor equal to 0. Now, one of these factors, 4, our greatest common factor, does not equal 0. So when that happens, when you have a constant that you factored out, that turns into a non-factor. It's not a solution. So you just cancel that one out, and then you set the other equal to 0, because this 4 can never equal 0, so that's why it's not one of the solutions. So our two solutions for number 2 would be x equals 2 and x equals -2. Okay, our last method is using the quadratic formula. And the first things to realize with the quadratic formula is we can find those same solutions using this formula of x equals -b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. So first, remember that our standard form is really important here when we pull out our a, b, and c. We must have the equation in standard form, the highest exponent down to the constant, and set equal to 0. Then we're going to use those values to substitute into the quadratic formula. So in our example 1, our a here, the number in front of the x squared, is a 1. Our b here, the number in front of the x term, is a -2. And our c is the number, the constant, and that would be -8. So that's always our first step. Write out a, b, and c. Now we're going to substitute those three into our quadratic formula. So x equals, we always use parentheses when we substitute in, so we have a -2 for b, plus or minus, and then our -2 squared minus 4 times 1 times a -8. Then all over our 2 times our a, which again was 1. So then we're going to simplify. Always start with the square root. It's inside the parentheses. Remember our order of operations. So we would have -2 squared would be 4, and then a minus 4 times 1 times -8. So -4 times 1 is -4. -4 times -8 would be plus 32. All over 2 times a. Here we can keep simplifying. So 4 plus 32 would be 36. So we have the square root of 36. And we have a negative times a -2 would be 2. So 2 plus and minus the square root of 36 all over 2 times 1. Our square root of 36, remember, is 6. So we have 2 plus or minus 6 over 2. So that means we have a 2 plus 6 over 2 and a 2 minus 6 over 2. So if we write that out, 2 plus 6 over 2 and 2 minus 6 over 2, and then simplify, we would have 8 over 2, which would be equal to 4, and -4 over 2, which would be equal to -2. And notice that the quadratic formula found the same answer as we did with factoring. Notice that these are the same problems. Okay, there's going to be a second short video tonight. So I want you to go ahead and try number 2, and then start the second video to see if you did it right.